The tribunal is now in session. We call defendant Rosenberg.
Graphical data.
I was born on 12th January 1893 in Revel, Estonia, when the German-Russian front lines approached in 1915. The Institute of Technology was evacuated to Moscow, and there I continued my studies. To the Baltic Germans, notwithstanding their loyalty toward the Russian state, the homeland of German culture was an intellectual home, and the experience I had in Russia strengthened my desire, my decision to do everything within my power to help prevent the political movement in Germany from backsliding into Bolshevism.
You mentioned Germany as your intellectual home. Will you tell the tribunal through which studies and by which scientists you've been influenced in favor of Germany?
In addition to my immediate interest in architecture and painting, I had since childhood pursued historical and philosophical studies, and thus, of course, I felt compelled to read Goethe, Hermann, and Fitt in order to develop intellectually along these lines. At the same time, I was influenced by the social ideas of Charles Dickens, Carlyle, and Emerson.
The tribunal wants you to confine yourself to your own philosophical subjects at all times.
How did you come to the National Socialist Party and to Hitler in München?
In May 1919, the publisher of a journal was visited by a man by the name of Anton Drexler, who introduced himself as the chairman of the newly founded German Labour Party. There, in the autumn of 1919, I also met Hitler.
And when did you join Hitler?
Well, at the time, I had a serious conversation with Hitler, and on that occasion I noticed his broad view of the entire European situation. He said that in his opinion, Europe was at that time going through a social and political crisis. I would like to add that the name National Socialism, I believe, originated in the Sudetenland, and there the small German Labour Party was founded under the name of National Socialist German Labour Party. We considered that the representation of national interests should not be based on privileges of certain classes, but on the contrary, on a national basis. The demand for national unity, on the contrary, is dignified representation on the part of the people with the right attitude. This resulted for Hitler in the defense that he favored...
Dr. Thoma, would you try to confine the witness to the charges which are against him?
In my opinion, we have to devote some time to Rosenberg's train of thought to determine the motives for his actions. But I will now ask him this. Why did you fight against democracy as a matter of international struggle?
Mr. President, Amistad, Executive Trial Counsel. Mr. President, I should like to say that no one in the prosecution has made any charge against this defendant for what he has thought. I think we are all, as a matter of opinion, opposed to prosecuting any man for what he thinks.
To my knowledge, the defendant is also accused of fighting democracy, and that is why I believe I should put this question to him.
What is the question?
Why he was fighting democracy, why National Socialism and he himself was fighting democracy.
I don't think that has got anything to do with the case. The only question is whether he used National Socialism for the purpose of conducting international offenses.
To my knowledge, the charge of waging a war of aggression was preferred because it was a war against democracy, because based on nationalism and socialism.
Democracy outside Germany, not in Germany.
Then I would like to ask the defendant how he will answer the charge that National Socialism preached a master race.
I have never heard the word master race as often as in this courtroom. To my knowledge, I did not mention or use it at all in my writing. I spoke of a master race as mentioned by Homer only once. And I found a quotation from a British author who, in writing about the life of Lord Kitchener, said the Englishman who had conquered the world had proved himself as a creative Superman.
I would like to ask the following question. You believe that the so-called Jewish problem in Europe could only be answered by removing the Jews from the European continent. How and why did you arrive at that opinion? I mean to say, how, in your opinion, would the departure of the last Jew from Europe solve the problem?
It seemed to me that after an epoch of generous emancipation in the course of national movements of the 19th century, an essential part of the Jewish nation also remembered its own tradition and its own character, and more consciously segregated itself from other nations. But my attitude in the political sphere to the Jewish question was due partly to my observations and experience of Jews in Russia, and later to my experience of them in Germany, which especially seemed to me to confirm their strangeness.
Rosenberg, what do you say to the fact that in the First World War, 12,000 Jewish soldiers died at the front?
Oh, of course, I was always conscious of the fact that many Jewish German citizens were assimilated into the German environment. But on the whole, this did not involve the entire social and political movement. Prominent Jewish people and the chairman of the Democratic Party suggested 3 times, quite openly, that in view of the increase in unemployment, Germans should be deported to Africa and Asia.
At Rosenberg, you were the official appointed by the Führer for the supervision of the entire spiritual and ideological education in the National Socialist Party. Did you exert any influence on national lawmaking in that capacity?
The party chancellery occasionally asked me to define my position with regard to this or that question, but was not obligated to take my views into consideration.
At Rosenberg, did you know anything about the concentration camps?
Yes, this question, of course, has been put to everybody. And the fact that concentration camps existed became known to me in 1933. But I must state that I knew by name only 2 concentration camps, Nuremberg and Dachau.
And did you participate in the evacuation of the Jews from Germany?
I should perhaps add one thing. I visited no real concentration camp, neither Dachau nor any other one. I once questioned Himmler, it was in 1938, about the concentration camps and told him that one saw in the foreign press all sorts of reports of alleged atrocities which were being committed in them. Himmler said to me, well, why don't you come to Dachau and take a look for yourself? Look at these things. We have a swimming pool there, and we have sanitary installations, irreproachable. No objections can't be raised. I did not visit the camp, because if something improper had been going on, Himmler would probably not have shown it to me. On the other hand, for reasons of good taste, I did not want to go simply to observe people who had been deprived of their liberty. An American chaplain has very kindly given me in my cell a church paper from Columbus. I gather from that the United States, too, arrested Jehovah's Witnesses during the war, and that until December 1945, 11,000 of them were still detained in camps. I presume that under such conditions, every state would take similar actions against nationals who refused to do war service in some form or another. And that was my attitude too. I could not consider Himmler wrong in this connection.
Nothing further.
If I remember correctly, you said that that was sometime in 1938, is that so?
Yeah. I testified that I discussed the concentration camps with him once, but I cannot say with certainty that it was in 1938, as I did not make a note of it.
Very good. He suggested you should go through one or the other of these camps, Dachau or some other camp. Is that so?
Yeah. He then told me that I should take a look at the Dachau camp.
And you declined the invitation?
Right.
And if I recollect correctly, I understood you to say that the reason you declined was because you were quite sure that he would not show you those unfavorable things that were in that camp?
Yeah. I assumed more or less that if there really were unfavorable things, I certainly would not see them anyway.
You mean you simply assumed there were unfavorable things? That you didn't know there were unfavorable things?
I heard this enough through the foreign press.
When did you first hear that through the foreign press?
It was in the months of 1923.
And did you continuously read the foreign press about the concentration camps in Germany from 1933 to 1938?
I did not read the foreign press at all, for unfortunately I do not speak English. I only received some excerpts from time to time, and in the German press there were occasional references to the allegations in the foreign press. And it was emphatically denied that there was any truth in these allegations. I can still remember a statement by Goering in which he said that it was beyond his comprehension that anything like that could be written.
Did you ever talk about the extermination of the Jews?
I have not in general spoken about the extermination of the Jews in the sense of this term. One has to consider the words. The term extermination has been used by the British Prime Minister.
You will refer to the words. You just tell me now whether you ever said it or not. You said that you did not?
Not in a single speech in that sense.
I understand the sense. Did you ever talk about it with anybody as a matter of state policy or party policy about the extermination of the Jews?
In a conference with the Führer, there was once an open discussion on this question, apropos of an intended speech, which was not delivered.
When was it you were going to deliver that speech? Approximately what was the date?
In December 1941.
Then you had written into your speech remarks about the extermination of the Jews, hadn't you? Answer that yes or no.
I have said already that the word does not have the sense which you attribute to it.
I will come to the word and the meaning of it. I am asking you, did you use the word or the term extermination of the Jews in the speech which you prepared to make in the Sport Palace in December of 1941? Now, you can answer that pretty simply.
That may be, but I do not remember. I myself did not prepare the phrasing of the draft. In which form it was expressed, I can no longer say.
Well then, perhaps we can help you with that. Will you take a look at document 1517 PS? It becomes Exhibit USA 824.
Yeah.
Now, this is a memorandum of yours, written by you about a discussion you had with Hitler on 14 December 1941. If you will take a look at the second paragraph, you will find these words, and I quote, "I took the standpoint not to speak of the extermination, Ausrottung, of the Jews. The Führer affirmed this and said that they had thrust the war upon us and that they had brought the destruction. It is no wonder if the results would strike them first." End quotes. Now, you have indicated that you have some difficulty with the meaning of that word, and I'm going to ask that you be shown. You are familiar with the standard German-English dictionary, Keitel, I suppose, are you? Do you know this work? Ever heard of it?
No.
This is something you will be interested in. Will you look up and read out to the tribunal what the definition of Ausrottung is?
I do not need a foreign dictionary in order to explain what various meaning in the German language the word Ausrottung may have. One can exterminate an idea, an economic system, a social order, and, as a final consequence, also a group of human beings, certainly. Those are many possibilities which are contained in that word. For that I do not need an English-German dictionary. Translations from German into English are so often wrong. For example, in that last document you have submitted to me, I heard again the translation of Hermann.
All right, I'm not interested in that. Let us deal on this term, Ausrottung. I take it then you agree that it does mean to wipe out or to kill off, as it is understood, and that you did use the term in speaking to Hitler.
Here again, I hear a different translation. which again used new German words. So, I cannot determine what you wanted to express in English.
Are you very serious in pressing this apparent inability of yours to agree with me about that word, or are you trying to kill time? Don't you know there are plenty of people in this courtroom who speak German and who agree that it does mean to wipe out, to extirpate?
It means to overcome, in one sense. And then it is used not with respect to individuals, but rather to judicial entities and to certain historical traditions. In another sense, the word had been used with respect to the German people. And we have not believed that it meant that 60 millions of Germans would be shot.
I want to remind you that this speech of yours, that in which you used the term Astrotum, was about 6 months after Himmler told Hess, whom you heard on this witness stand, to start exterminating Jews. That is a fact, is it not?
Then may I perhaps say something about the use of the words. We are speaking here of extermination of Jewry. Oh, there is also still a difference between Jewry and individual Jews.
I have nothing further.
Herr Speer, do you please tell the tribunal about your life up until the time you were appointed minister?
I was born on 19th March 1905. My grandfather and my father were successful architects. At first, I wanted to study mathematics and physics, but studied architecture, more because of tradition than inclination. In 1934, Hitler noticed me for the first time. Hitler was quite fanatical on the subject of architecture, and I received many important construction contracts from him.
And when did your activity as minister start?
In 1942, my predecessor was killed in an aeroplane crash. Immediately upon assuming office, it was plain that not building but armament production was to be my main task.
The prosecution makes a charge that you shared the responsibility for the recruitment of foreign workers and prisoners of war and took manpower from concentration camps. What do you say to this?
In this connection, neither I nor the ministry were responsible for this. The ministry was a new establishment which had a technical problem to deal with. It took no competence in any field away from an existing authority.
Herr Speer, in the year 1943, you visited the concentration camp at Mauthausen?
The camp, or the small part of the camp which I saw, appeared to me to be very clean. But I did not see any of the workers, any of the camp inmates, since at the time they were all engaged in work.
And did you learn on your visit to Mauthausen or on another occasion about the cruelties which took place at this concentration camp and at other concentration camps?
No.
Herr Speer, according to this document paragraph 24, exhibit USA 179, you proposed that the factories could be staffed entirely with internees from concentration camps. Did you carry that out?
No.
As far as you remember, did you ever make any statements regarding ideology, anti-Semitism, etc.?
No. I assumed that otherwise the prosecution would be in a position to produce some evidence of such statements.
Herr Speer, were you able to carry on political discussions with Hitler?
No. He regarded me as a purely technical minister. Attempts to discuss political or personal problems with him always failed because of the fact he was unapproachable. Hitler knew how to confine every man to his own specialty. He himself was therefore the only coordinating factor. This was far beyond his strengths and also his capacity.
Then, as an expert minister, do you wish to limit your responsibility to your sphere of work?
No. I should like to say something of fundamental importance here. This war has brought inconceivable catastrophe to the German people and has started a world catastrophe. Therefore, it is my unquestionable duty to assume my share of responsibility for this misfortune before the German people. Insofar as Hitler gave me orders and I carried them out, I assume the responsibility for them. I did not, of course, carry out all the orders which he gave me.
In January 1945, Speer sent a memorandum to Hitler, quote, "The material superiority of the enemy can no longer be counterbalanced, even by the bravery of our soldiers." Herr Speer, what did you mean by that quote?
During this period, Hitler attributed the outcome of the war in an increasing degree to the failure of the German people, but he never blamed himself.
Was no unified action taken by some of Hitler's closer advisors in this hopeless situation to demand the termination of the war?
No. No unified action was taken by the leading men in Hitler's circle. A step like this was quite impossible, for these men considered themselves either as pure specialists, or else as people whose job was to receive orders, or as merely resigned themselves to the situation.
You have described how much you did to preserve industrial plants and other economic installations. Did you also act on behalf of the foreign workers?
My responsibility was the industrial sector. I felt it my duty, therefore, to hand over my sector undamaged. As regards the foreign workers in Germany, several of my actions were in their favor. For example, through the steps which I had taken to secure the food situation.
Herr Speer, during the last phase of the war, you were opposed to Hitler and his policies. Why did you not resign?
I thought it was my duty to remain at my post.
I have one last question. Was it possible for you to reconcile your actions during the last phase of the war with your oath and your conception of loyalty to Adolf Hitler?
There is one loyalty which everyone must always keep, and that is loyalty towards one's own people. That duty comes before everything. If I am in a leading position, and if I see that acts are being committed against the interests of the nation, I must oppose them. That Hitler had broken faith with the nation must have been clear to every intelligent member of his circle, certainly at the latest in January or February 1945. Hitler had been given his mission by the people, but he had no right to gamble away the destiny of the people with his own. Therefore, I fulfilled my natural duty as a German. I did not succeed in every way, but I am proud today that with my achievements, I was able to render one more service to the workers in Germany and the occupied territories.
It was known throughout Germany, was it not? The concentration camps were, how do I put this, pretty rough places in which to be.
Yes, but not to the extent which has been revealed during this trial.
The bad reputation of the concentration camps, as a matter of fact, was useful in making people afraid of being sent there, was it not?
No doubt, concentration camps were a menace used to keep order.
And to make people go to work, correct?
I would not like to put it that way. I would say that a great number of the foreign workers in our country did their work quite voluntarily once they had come to Germany.
Well, you knew the policy of the Nazi Party, the policy of the government toward the Jews, did you not?
I knew that the National Socialist policy was anti-Semitic, and I knew that the Jews were being evacuated from Germany.
In fact, you participated in the evacuation, did you not?
No. It is clear that if the Jews who were evacuated had been allowed to work for me, it would have been a considerable advantage to me.
Well, as I understand it, Herr Speer, you knew about the deportation of 100,000 Jews from Hungary for subterranean airplane factories, and you made no objection to it. Now that is true, is it not?
That is true, yes.
And whether legal or illegal means were used to obtain workers, that did not worry you.
I considered that in light of the whole war situation, and of our views in general on this question, it was justified.
Yes, yes. And it was in accordance with the policy of the government, and that satisfied you at the time, did it not?
Yes. I am of the opinion that at the time I took over my office, in February of 1942, all the violations of international law which now are brought up against me had already been committed.
Later, when you differed with the people who wanted to continue the war to the bitter end, that you wanted to see Germany have a chance to restore her life, that is a fact, is it not? Whereas Hitler took the position that if he could not survive the war, he did not care whether Germany survived or not.
That's true. The letter which I wrote to Hitler on the 29th of March, 1945, shows that he said so himself. The unreasonable people who were still left only amounted perhaps to a few dozens. The remaining 80 millions were perfectly sensible as soon as they knew what the situation really was.
Well, perhaps you had a sense of responsibility for having put the 80 million completely in the power of the Führer principle. Did that occur to you? Or does it now as you look back?
May I have the question repeated? I didn't understand it.
Certainly. You have 80 million sane and sensible people facing destruction. You have a dozen people driving them on to destruction, and they, the 80 million, are unable to stop it. And I ask if you have a feeling of responsibility for having established the Führer principle, which Goering has so well described for us.
I, personally, when I became minister in February 1942, placed myself at the disposal of the Führer principle. But I admit that in my organization, I soon saw that the Führer principle was in many ways defective, and so I tried to weaken its effect. The tremendous danger of the totalitarian system, however, only became really clear at the moment that we were approaching the end. It was then that one could see what the principle really meant, namely that every order should be carried out without criticism. The combination of Hitler and this system has brought about these tremendous catastrophes in the world.
I want to ask you some questions about your efforts to produce essential goods and the conditions that this regime was imposing upon labor. I think you can give some information about this. You were frequently at the Krupp plant, were you not?
I was at the Krupp plant 5 or 6 times.
Very well, very well. I will ask to have you shown document 230D, which is an inter-office record of steel switches. And the steel switches which have been found in the camp will be shown to you, 80 of them, distributed according to the reports.
Those are nothing but replacements for rubber truncheons. We had no rubber, and for that reason, the guards probably had something like this.
Okay, so that's the same inference that I drew from the document.
Yes, but the guards did not immediately use these steel switches any more than your police use their rubber truncheons. But they had to have something in their hands. It is the same thing all over the world.
In a statement some time ago, you said you had a certain responsibility as a minister of the government for the condition of foreign and German workers. You refer to common responsibility. What do you mean by your common responsibility? You mean along with others?
Oh, yes. In my opinion, a state functionary has 2 types of responsibility. One is a responsibility for his own sector, and for that, of course, he is fully responsible. But above that, I think that in decisive matters, there is and must be, among the leaders, a joint responsibility. For who is to take responsibility for general developments, if not the close associates of the head of state?
I have nothing further.
Would the defense counsel like to re-examine the witness?
Herr Speer, I refer to the answer that you gave to Justice Jackson at the end of the cross-examination. And to clarify that answer, I would like to ask you this. In assuming a common responsibility, did you want to acknowledge measurable guilt or co-responsibility under the penal law, or did you want to record an historical responsibility before your own people?
That question is very difficult to answer. It is actually one which the tribunal will decide in its verdict. I only want to say that even in an authoritarian system, the leaders must accept a common, united responsibility, and that it is impossible after the catastrophe to avoid this responsibility. If the war had been won, the leaders would presumably have laid claim to full responsibility. But to what extent that is punishable or immoral, that I cannot decide, and it is not for me to decide.
You said the concentration camps had a bad reputation, remember? Is that right?
Yes.
What did you mean by bad reputation? What sort of reputation? For what?
That is hard to define. It was known in Germany that a stay in a concentration camp was an unpleasant experience. I knew that, but I did not know any details.
Well, even if you did not know any details, it is not unpleasant, putting it mildly. Wasn't the reputation that violence and physical punishment were used in the camps, was not that the reputation that you meant? Is that fair to say?
No, that is going a little too far on the basis of what we knew. I assumed that there was ill treatment in individual cases, but I did not assume that it was the rule. I did not know that I must explain that during the time I was a minister, strange as it may sound, I became less disturbed about the concentration camp inmates than I had been before I became a minister. Because while I was in office, I heard only good and reassuring reports about the concentration camps from official sources. It was said that the food was being improved and so on and so forth.
I am done. I have nothing further of this witness.
You may take your seat. Whether they wish to make statements. First, Defendant Goering.
The prosecution uses the fact that I was the second man of the state as proof that I must have known everything that happened. But it does not present any documentary or other convincing proof in cases where I have denied under oath that I knew about certain things or even desired them. Repeatedly, we have heard here how the worst crimes were veiled with the utmost secrecy. I wish to state expressly that I condemn utterly these terrible mass murders, and so that there shall be no misunderstanding in this connection, I wish before the high tribunal that I have never decreed the murder of a single individual at any time, nor decreed any other atrocities, nor tolerated them while I had the power and the knowledge to prevent them. I stand behind the things that I have done, but I deny most emphatically that my actions were dictated by the desire to subjugate foreign peoples or to commit atrocities or crimes. The only motive which guided me was my ardent love for my people and my desire for their happiness and freedom. And for this, I call on the Almighty and my German people as witness.
It is far from my intention to minimize my part in what took place. At the end of this trial, I want to present frankly the avowal and confession I have to make today. In the course of the trial, my defense counsel submitted two fundamental questions to me. First, in case of victory, would you have refused to participate in any part of the success? I answered no. I should certainly have been proud of it. The second question was, how would you act if you were in the same position again? My answer, then I would rather choose death than allow myself to be drawn into the net of such pernicious methods. I believed, I erred, and I was not in a position to prevent what should have been prevented. That is my guilt. It is tragic to have to realize that the best I had to give as a soldier, obedience and loyalty, was exploited for purposes which could not be recognized at the time, and that I did not see that there is a limit set even for a soldier's performance of his duty. That is my fate.
Besides repeating the old accusations, the prosecution claimed that you all attended secret conferences in order to plan a war of aggression. Besides that, we are supposed to have ordered the alleged murder of 12 millions of people. These accusations are described as genocide, the murder of peoples. In this connection, I wish to summarize as follows. I know my conscience to be completely free from any such guilt. I attempted to improve the physical and spiritual conditions of their existence instead of destroying their personal security and human dignity. The sort of a physical annihilation of Slavs and Jews, that is to say, the actual murder of entire peoples, has never entered my mind. I was of the opinion that the existing Jewish question would have to be solved by the creation of a minority right, immigration, or by settling Jews in a national territory. The white paper of the British government of 24 July 1946 shows how historical developments can bring about measures which were never previously planned. I understood my struggle, just as it was understood by many thousands of my comrades, to be one conducted for the noblest idea, an idea which had been fought for under flying banners for over 100 years.
Easy tribunal. Hitler and the collapse of his system have brought about a time of tremendous suffering upon the German people. The useless continuation of the war and the unnecessary destruction makes the work of reconstruction more difficult. Privation and misery have come to the German people. After this trial, the German people will despise and condemn Hitler as the proved author of his misfortune. But the world will learn from these happenings not only to hate dictatorship as a form of government, but to fear it. Hitler's dictatorship differed in one fundamental point from all its predecessors in history. His was the first dictatorship in the present period of modern technical development. A dictatorship which made a complete use of all technical means in a perfect manner for the domination of his own country. Through technical devices like the radio and the loudspeaker, 80 million people were deprived of independent thought. It was thereby possible to subject them to the will of one man. The telephone, teletype, and radio made it possible, for instance, that orders from the highest sources could be transmitted directly to the lowest ranking units, by whom, because of the high authority, they were carried out without criticism. Therefore, the more technical the world becomes, the more necessary is the promotion of individual freedom and the individual's awareness of himself as a counterbalance. In 5 to 10 years, the technique of warfare will make it possible to fire rockets from continent to continent with uncanny precision. By atomic fission, it can destroy 1 million people in the center of New York in seconds. Science is able to spread pestilence among human beings and animals and destroy crops by insect warfare. Chemistry has developed terrible methods with which it can inflict unspeakable suffering upon helpless human beings. This trial must contribute towards preventing such degenerate wars in the future and towards establishing rules whereby human beings can live together. Of what importance is my own fate after everything that has happened in comparison with this high goal? It is not war alone which shapes the history of humanity, but also, in a higher sense, the cultural achievements which one day will become the common property of all humanity. But a nation which believes in its future will never perish. May God protect Germany and the culture of the West.
Is that in the long perspective of history, the present century will not hold an admirable position, unless its second half is to redeem its first. No half-century ever witnessed slaughter on such a scale, such cruelties and inhumanities, such wholesale deportations of people into slavery, such annihilations of minorities. Crimes in the conduct of warfare were planned with thoroughness as a means of ensuring the victory of German armies. I admit that Hitler was the chief villain, but for the defendants to put all blame on him is neither manly nor true. We know that even the head of a state has the same limits to his senses and to the hours of his day as have lesser men. He must rely on others to be his eyes and ears for most that goes on in a great empire. Other legs must run his errands. Other hands must execute his plans. On whom did Hitler rely for such things more than upon these men in the dock? Who led him to believe that he had an invincible air armada, if not Goering? Who fed his illusion of German invincibility, if not Keitel? Who kept his hatred of the Jew inflamed more than Rosenberg? These men had access to Hitler. They were the Praetorian Guard, and while they were under Caesar's orders, Caesar was always in their hands. These defendants now ask this tribunal to say that they are not guilty of planning, executing, or conspiring to commit this long list of crimes and wrongs. We stand before the record of this trial as blood-stained Gloucester stood by the body of his slain king. He begged of his widow, as they beg of you, "Say I slew them not." And the queen replied, "Then say they were not slain, but dead they are." If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true as to say there's been no war, there are no slain, there has been no crime.
That these defendants participated in and are morally guilty of crimes so frightful that the imagination staggers and reels back at their very contemplation is not in doubt. In their graves, crying out not for vengeance, but that this shall not happen again, are 10 million who might be living in peace and happiness at this hour. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and civilians killed in battles that ought never to have been. Nor was that their only or greatest crime, not in battle, not in passion, but in the cold, calculated, deliberate attempt to destroy nations and races, to disintegrate the traditions, the institutions, and the very existence of free and ancient states. 2/3 of the Jews in Europe exterminated. More than 6 million of them on the killer's own figures. For such crimes, these men might well have been proceeded against by executive action, and had the treatment which they had been parties to meting out against so many millions of innocent people been meted out to them, they could hardly have complained. But this tribunal is to adjudge their guilt not on any moral or ethical basis alone, but according to law. Let them now, accused murderers as they are, attempt to belittle the power and influence they exercise how they will. We have only to recall their raunting as they strutted across the stage of Europe, dressed in their brief authority, to see the part they played. They did not then tell the German people of the world that they were merely the ignorant, powerless puppets of their Führer. The defendant Speer has said, and I quote, "Even in a totalitarian system, there must be total responsibility. It is impossible after the catastrophe to evade this total responsibility. If the war had been won, the leaders would also have assumed total responsibility." End of quote. Almost immediately after the war had started, the organized extermination of the Jewish race began. Hess describes the improvements that he made at Auschwitz. He introduced the new gas, Zyklon B, which, quote, took from 3 to 15 minutes to kill the people in the death chamber, dependent on climatic conditions. We knew the people were dead because their screaming stopped. End of quote. Let the engineer Graby speak of the massacre at Dubno. Quote, on 5th October 1942, my foreman told me that Jews from Dubno had been shot in 3 large pits, each about 30 meters long and 3 meters deep. About 1,500 persons had been killed daily. All of the 5,000 Jews who had been living in Dubno before the pogrom were to be liquidated. I drove to the site and went directly to the pits. The people who had gotten off the trucks, men, women, and children of all ages, had to undress upon the orders of an SS man who carried a riding or a dog whip. They had to put down their clothes in fixed places sorted according to shoes, top clothing, and underclothing. I saw great heaps of shoes of about 800 to 1,000 pairs, great piles of underlinen and clothing. Without screaming or weeping, these people undressed, stood round in family groups, kissed each other, said farewells, and waited for a sign from another SS man who stood near the pit, also with a whip in his hand. During the 15 minutes that I stood near, I heard no complaint or plea for mercy. I watched a family of about 8 persons, a man and a woman, both about 50, with their children of about 1, 8, and 10, and 2 grown daughters of about 20 to 24. An old woman with snow-white hair was holding the 1-year-old child in her arms and singing to it and tickling it. The child was cooing with delight. The couple were looking on with tears in their eyes. The father was holding the hand of the boy about 10 years old and speaking to him softly. The boy was fighting his tears. The father pointed to the sky, stroked his head, and seemed to explain something to him. At that moment, the SS man at the pit shouted something to his comrade. The latter counted off about 20 persons and instructed them to go behind the earth mound. Among them was the family which I have mentioned. I well remember a girl, slim and with black hair, who, as she passed close to me, pointed to herself and said, 23. I walked round the mound and found myself confronted by a tremendous grave. People were closely wedged together and lying on top of each other so that only their heads were visible. Nearly all had blood running over their shoulders from their heads. Some of the people shot were still moving. Some were lifting their arms and turning their heads to show that they were still alive. The pit was already 2/3 full. I estimated that it already contained about 1,000 people. I looked for the man who did the shooting. He was an SS man who sat at the edge of the narrow end of the pit, his feet dangling into the pit. He had a Tommy gun on his knees and was smoking a cigarette. The people, completely naked, went down some steps that were cut in the clay wall of the pit and clambered over the heads of the people lying there to the place to which the SS man directed them. They laid down in front of the dead or injured people. Some caressed those who were still alive and spoke to them in a low voice. Then I heard a series of shots. I looked into the pit and saw that the bodies were twitching, or heads lying motionless on top of the bodies which lay before them. Blood was running away from the necks. I was surprised that I was not ordered away. On the morning of the next day, when I again visited the site, I saw about 30 naked people lying near the pit, about 30 to 50 meters away from it. Some of them are still alive. They looked straight in front of them with a fixed stare and seemed to notice neither the chilliness of the morning nor the workers of my firm who stood round. A girl of about 20 spoke to me and asked me to give her clothes and help her escape. At that moment we heard a fast car approach and I noticed that it was an SS detail. I moved away to my site. 10 minutes later, we heard shots from the vicinity of the pit. The Jews, still alive, had been ordered to throw the corpses into the pit. Then they had themselves to lie down in this, to be shot in the neck. End of quote. The proposition that you are asked to accept is that a man who was either a minister or a leading executive in a state, which within the space of 6 years transported in horrible conditions some 7 million men, women, and children for labor, exterminated 275,000 of its own aged and mentally infirm, and annihilated in gas chambers or by shooting what must at the lowest computation be 12 million people, remained ignorant of or irresponsible for these crimes? You are asked to accept that the horrors of the transports, of the conditions of this slave labor, deployed as it was in labor camps throughout the country, the smell of the burning bodies, all of which were known to the world, were not known to these 12 men by whose orders such things were given. In one way, the fate of these men means little. Their personal power for evil lies forever broken. They have convicted and discredited each other and finally destroyed the legend they created around the figure of their leader. This trial must form a milestone in the history of civilization, not only bringing retribution to these guilty men, but also that the ordinary people of the world, and I make no distinction between friend or foe, are now determined that the individual must transcend the state. You will remember, when you come to give your decision, the story of Dubno, but not in vengeance, in a determination that these things shall not occur again. The father, you remember, pointed to the sky. It seemed to say something.
Count 1, guilty. Count 2, guilty. Count 3, guilty. Count 4, guilty. Sentence, death. Defendant Wilhelm Keitel. Count 1, guilty. Count 2, guilty. Count 3, guilty. Count 4, guilty. Sentence, death. Defendant Alfred Rosenberg. Count 1, guilty. Count 2, guilty. Count 3, guilty. Count 4, guilty. Sentence, death. Defendant Albert Spear. Count 1, not guilty. Count 2, not guilty. Count 3, guilty. Count 4, guilty. Sentence, 20 years. Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Hess was tried in a second tribunal, was convicted of crimes against humanity